This show is a Hopful Media podcast production.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois-Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois-Burgundy.
You are listening to the History of Persia podcast. And as we've been hearing from Trevor, the history of the Persian Empire is a story of Persian domination of much of the Middle East and Central Asia. But this was not the first time these lands were conquered, and it would certainly not be the last. I don't want to give too much away, but in the year 329 BCE, the important Persian city of Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan was conquered by some guy by the name of Alexander. But what's interesting about this city is that about 1700 years later, this same city, Samarkand, would be the glowing capital of an empire forged by a man known as Timur, or Tamerlane, or simply Timur. And Timur has gone down in history as a fantastic tactician, a man who supposedly never lost a battle, a great patron of the arts, and one of the most brutal conquerors of all time. From about 1365 until 1405 CE, Timur was almost constantly at war, building for himself an empire that stretched from modern-day Turkey to India, from Syria to the Russian steppe, and I want to know how and why this happened. If that sounds interesting to you and you want the story of Timur told by a guy who talks too fast and has loud neighbors, then check out my show, The Timur Podcast. Find out more about it at timurpodcast.com or listen to it in most places where you find podcasts. And with that said, take it away, Trevor.
Okay, have you done anything at all like this ever before in your life?
No.
Alright. Do you have any questions?
No.
Could you ask a question anyway so I can get more of your voice on recording?
Do you need my voice in recording just for audio assurance?
Great. Try to speak a little louder.
A little louder.
Perfect. That's what we want.
Okay.
Alright. You ready to do this?
Okay.
If you take a drink, slurp quietly.
Okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to America Secret Wars, the podcast all about the forgotten, overlooked, and deliberately covered up times the United States has used military force against foreign nations or to occupy foreign soil. I'm your host, Trevor Cullen, and before we get going today, I have some required disclaimers. America Secret Wars and Hopful Media are not affiliated with the United States Navy, the military as a whole, or the wider federal government in any way. Nothing we say here is intended as an endorsement of a specific political party, platform, or candidate. Any opinions expressed are our own as separate individuals. Guest, do you agree to that statement?
I agree.
Great. I also, as a warning to the audience, have no idea how the audio quality is going to turn out today, because I am recording multiple voices into one microphone in a tiny redneck-ass room in my parents' basement. But I have my younger brother, Petty Officer 2nd Class Evan Cullen, with me. How the hell are you doing?
Wonderful.
I got your rank right.
Yes.
Good. So I have Evan here on loan from the Navy for the first time in 3 years, and I couldn't think of a better guest for this episode in particular, for reasons that we will get to in a minute. Evan knows only a very small amount of what we're going to talk about today, mostly that it has to do with a specific country. But before we get to that country, Evan, I have a question that I ask all of my guests for this podcast. What was your relationship with American history in high school?
I didn't really touch on American history too much in high school. It was, I think, sophomore year that we actually had a class, but, it was sophomore year in high school, and I didn't really take high school that serious in general, so...
Yeah, the fun thing about this question today is that Evan and I had most of the same history curriculum growing up.
Pretty much the exact same history, except I'm pretty sure you probably took AP history class at some point.
Yeah, that actually means you probably covered more American history than I did, because we went back to 1492 7 times, and you at least got one time where they started after the Civil War.
Yeah, accurate.
Warning, listeners, there will be dogs barking in the background. Our parents' dog is a monster.
I don't even know if it's picking those up, though.
It's best to just put the warning in.
And it might also hear the floor creaking above us.
Yeah, I thought he was in bed. Anyway, so far I'm on a winning streak with the second question in my loadout here, but I am guessing you're going to break that today. Evan, do you know anything about an obscure archipelago off the coast of Asia called, Japan? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Have you? You know anything about Japan, Evan?
I know a little bit about Japan.
You want to tell people why you know anything about Japan?
So the reason why this is the first time that he's had me on loan from the Navy in the past 3 years is because I have spent the past 3 years living in Japan.
And now, listeners, you see why I wanted him on. Because today we're going to talk about the United States Navy fighting Japan. You might not be aware of this, Evan, audience, everyone together, but did you know that the United States has in fact used military force against the nation of Japan?
Have we? Never would have guessed.
Have you ever heard anything about that? Got any guesses when that might have happened?
I heard a few little dwindlings here and there about it. A couple inklings from, some of the top brass who were around that long. No, I don't have any idea what you're talking about.
Great. So today we're going to talk about the Battle of Shimonoseki Strait, aka the story of how Japan fought in the American Civil War.
Okay, not the part that I thought we were gonna hit.
Well, see, this is Secret Wars.
War. I guess the one that I was thinking of is talked about pretty often.
Yeah. On this show, we refer to that particular incident as Boomius Maximus.
Yeah, we call it the reason why it's just the sun. It's not the rising sun anymore.
Well, it's not the rising sun at this point either. That's the period in between the two events we're talking about right now. Just to run through some relevant terminology that you might have heard just, being around stuff over there. Have you ever picked up anything about the Choshu domain, the Edo period, or the Tokugawa shogunate?
No, I don't get a lot of history lessons out there.
I mean, I don't know, you might see it on a plaque at a museum or something. I don't know. You've been to Nagasaki. That's a big place in today's episode. Big place for other reasons.
Well, yeah, I was there for the museum for the other reasons.
Those other reasons are nukes, just in case anybody's unclear.
Big bombs.
We don't have to avoid that word. The Tokugawa shogunate is also a real popular setting for video games. If you've played Shogun Total War, that's the general time period that's talking about. So people might know at least some of the words we're using today. But let's get started with history. Evan, did you know this is a history podcast?
I was aware. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's a big secret about me and my family that I know anything. So what are now the islands of Japan were first settled by human beings about 40,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum of the Ice Age, vaguely as part of the same wave of migration actually as the one that brought people to North America for the first time. At that point, sea levels were so low that Hokkaido, the big northern island, was actually connected to mainland Asia, and the coastlines of Korea and Honshu were actually much closer together, making it pretty easy to travel by raft. To a certain degree, these first settlers were the cultural ancestors of the Ainu people, one of Japan's only indigenous minority groups, primarily on Hokkaido and the other northern islands. They are characterized by a different language, hunting and gathering and fishing lifestyles, and generally being their own cultural group, separate from mainstream Japan. Japanese majority culture as we know it today really starts with the Yayoi migration around 600 BCE, when another wave of people from mainland Asia brought things like farming and rice and writing and territorial state politics. Then they started carving everything up into little kingdoms with hierarchic nobility, wars over farmland, and all those things that generally make history fun to read and shitty to live through. Japan then spent about 2,000 years as a sort of one country, sort of a whole bunch of separate countries, in the broader cultural and political sphere of Eastern Asia. They were obviously islands off doing their own thing, but they weren't cut off from the rest of the world. It is really not that far between the islands of Japan and, say, the Korean peninsula.
Okay.
Occasionally, there was a strong emperor or a warlord who would manage to get most of Japan under their control, but that would collapse again and central authority fluctuated in and out of existence. Also, for all the weebs out there, give me a break. I am trying to condense about 2 millennia of history into a paragraph. Scraps of information about Eastern Asia filtered back to Europe starting around 100 BC, and the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius even sent ambassadors to China. But the closest thing to an actual description of Asian politics and geography Europe got in the entire pre-modern period was probably Marco Polo in the 14th century. And historians tend to think that most of his account was made up. But it did let Europeans know that Japan probably existed. So that's our starting point. Then we get the 1400s and all of Europe catches this terrifying pair of diseases called interest in the rest of the world and the ability to actually get there. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in Western Asia made trade difficult, and sailing technology came just far enough to get around the southern end of Africa and come back to Europe again, which is actually a problem we've talked about on my other podcast, The History of Persia. The Portuguese were at the forefront of this. They were kind of pushed off into the Atlantic by growing Spain, and that left them with only seaborne ways to really expand their power, but it's still weird that Portugal was such a big deal at the time. They became the first Europeans to establish trade with Japan in the 1550s. Also, I just want all the listeners to know that Evan is absolutely entranced by the audio waveform on the computer screen.
Yes, I am. And I just love a good history lesson.
Think he's lying, I can't tell. This wasn't all economic prosperity for everyone, though. Portugal, and before too long, basically everyone else in Europe followed their lead, wanting to be in charge of these new trade relationships. They tended to see others as culturally inferior, brought missionaries to Christianize the heathens, and they fought wars to carve out territory and control their new trade routes. In Japan, that meant Portugal conquering and ruling Nagasaki directly as a colony for decades. Did they talk about that?
No, that's actually not talked about at all. I knew about it, but it's never brought up. Like, nobody ever mentions it. Even if we actually are talking about history of Japan, like with our Japanese friends, they kind of ignore that part of history.
Yeah, it's still mostly a victory for Japan because they only had influence in Nagasaki. But the Portuguese did conquer a Japanese city for a little while, which I think gets overlooked.
I feel like it's something that not many people really talk about. It doesn't really get brought up ever.
Which is weird, because this is so not the last time we will be talking about Nagasaki.
No.
Other Europeans followed in their wake, especially the Dutch, who were increasingly prominent in East Asia. And yes, I said the Dutch, like the Netherlands. Portugal and the Netherlands leading the European conquest of Asian territory. The 1400s were a weird point for world history.
So the Dutch, there is still, imprints of their culture around Asia. And in Sasebo, where I'm stationed, there is an amusement park that is a Dutch-themed amusement park.
Really?
Yeah. And it's just a bunch of Dutch-looking buildings. People walk around wearing, lederhosen and stuff like that. And literally all there is to do there is eat cheese and drink wine and ride a Ferris wheel and eat good Italian food. And there's a Red Lobster there. But other than that, it's just a little Dutch town in the middle of Japan.
But there's not, a little there's not little Lisbon anywhere. That is so strange.
It's weird.
It's where you go to get Italian food, is the little Dutch town.
The little Dutch town where you get Italian food and drink French wine and eat American cheese.
Well, alright then. The other parts make sense to me. It's the Italian food in the Dutch resort town that I think is weird. Obviously, that's where you're going to get American cheese. Everyone knows that's the best type of cheese.
Well, obviously.
Huh. Also, it's about time I apologize for the crimes I am going to commit against the Japanese language. I do not speak it. I tend to find Romanization of East Asian languages unnecessarily bad. And I'm hoping that Evan will at least know a few more words than I do.
I'm hoping I do too.
However, there was a problem in Japan at the time we're talking about, highlighted even more dramatically in the west and south over in China, Taiwan, and further off in India, as well as Indonesia and the Spice Islands. European influence was starting to affect local society. People, to include several Japanese daimyos, local nobility warlords, converted to Catholicism in greater and greater numbers. These pasty white interlopers, let's say, kept trying to influence local politics, and Japan and China were lucky in that they got any return on their investment from the Europeans at all, unlike many of their neighbors. But generally, aside from introducing modern Western firearms, the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't seeing much benefit in keeping all of these white people around. So, they kicked them out. They required every Japanese person to register with the government as an official member of a Buddhist sect. They carried out pogroms against Japanese Christians, and aside from the occasional underground smuggling ring, Europeans were banned from the country. The Dutch and Portuguese alone were allowed to trade in Nagasaki. The Chinese were also limited to Nagasaki, so this wasn't just Europeans. This was anybody not from Japan. And other groups like the Koreans, the Ainu people, and the Ryukyu Islanders were mostly limited to the nearest daimyo's territory. So you've been there, Evan, but do you know the words, the Ryukyu Islands? Is that a phrase people still use?
Obviously they're not called the Ryukyu Islands anymore.
Ryukyu?
Yes.
Okay.
They aren't referred to as that anymore. But locally, they still are. If you're from that area, there's other islands. So,
yeah.
People who live around there will refer to a certain group of those islands as the Ryukyu Islands. But they're not called that officially.
Sure. For anybody wondering at home, the Ryukyu Islands are conventionally at least Okinawa and the couple of small islands around it, or more broadly, all of the smallish islands to include Okinawa between the big Japanese islands and Taiwan, roughly. So all of this kicking people out of the country and staunch isolationism wasn't just to prevent cultural change and keep the Europeans out. It was also to keep the Japanese in and actually change Japanese culture to become more centered around the shogun. This policy of isolation was called Sakoku, and it was just one point in a wider system that allowed the Tokugawa shoguns to bring all of the daimyos into orbit around themselves instead of having dozens of petty warlords all over the country. And as the unrivaled military and political master of this podcast, I am charging you, the audience, with a hereditary mandate. You and your children and their children after you are all hereby charged with listening to these advertisements and ensuring that no non-Japanese merchants try to trade with this podcast.
Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations, join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the oft-ignored stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo. Find the History of Africa podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Evan, what exclusively Japanese products do you think people heard about?
Something exclusively Japanese that people have heard about.
In those advertisements that everyone just heard, including you and me.
Oh, sushi.
Boy lives in Japan goes with the most generic answer possible. The one thing people might actually have heard an advertisement for.
Well, sushi over here is not the same as sushi over there.
No, we had a conversation about this at dinner tonight.
Yes, we did. Sushi in Japan is just a bed of rice with a slice of fish on top.
So you mean sashimi?
Not getting back into this. That's what sushi is. It's a bed of rice with a little slice of fish. You can put some soy sauce on it if you want. There's none of this, like, wrapping it up in seaweed with, like, cucumber and avocado and whatever else you want to put in it. It's just fish and rice.
This is the part where I'm going to get messages from Japanese listeners being like, actually, in one specific region.
Yeah, probably. To any Japanese listeners, the only sushi I really know is Sushiro, Kira Sushi, chains like that. Anywhere else, they don't really let me in.
It's almost like they still don't really want white people there.
Oh, they don't. Especially the older generation. Like, people like our age, they're cool with it.
What would the older generation have against American sailors in Japan, Evan? It's probably this stuff that we're talking about in the 1860s.
Yeah, that's probably it.
Alright, speaking of that, we left with Japan firmly in the grip of the Tokugawa shoguns and their isolationist policy of Sakoku in 1641.
Okay.
This policy meant that they actually missed the beginning of history when Jesus created the world on the 4th of July, 1776, by gifting humanity life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, as many AR-15s as you need to wipe out a small classroom, and approximately 3/5 of those things for anybody with skin darker than mine.
Amen.
Jesus.
Exactly.
And actually, I'm white as the driven snow, but tan enough right now that even I might be pushing it. We are talking about the United States of America on America's Secret Wars. I know you will all be very surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So, speedrun time. The U.S. declared independence in 1776, finished fighting its war for independence against the British, built up a navy when they realized that was kind of required in order to do international trade, fought a number of brutal wars against the indigenous people whose land they wanted to conquer and farm, accidentally bought about a third of North America in 1803, carried out an ethnic cleansing of the Southeast under Andrew Trail of Motherfucking Tears Jackson, declared itself the hegemon and defender of Republican democracy in the Western Hemisphere, invaded Spanish and later Mexican territory several times, culminating in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which saw the US of A conquer the northern half of Mexico.
Exactly.
By the end of the 1840s, there were two issues on everyone's mind: slavery, and where do we conquer next?
Mm-hmm.
So while Kansas was bleeding and the only real American hero, John Brown, was attempting to overthrow the government via slave revolt, elements of said government were looking across the Pacific Ocean to expand American influence. And if any of that sounds interesting to the folks at home, good, because that's basically my short list of topics for the next, 2 years of this podcast. Did you learn anything about the fact that we did things outside of North America in the 1800s in school?
Yeah. Well, not in school, no.
No,
No. The only thing that you learn about in the 1800s in school is the Civil War.
Yeah, and you usually get the line in American high school that we were an isolationist country until the world wars, and we had a very small army and didn't get involved.
We very much were not isolationists.
No, you can't be isolationist and conquer half of Mexico.
No.
And they always say that the army was small. There are other branches to the military, and our navy may have been small compared to, the British Empire, but we also managed to have naval bases all over the planet in the middle of the 1800s. So now we need to meet one of our main characters and sure to be frequent friend of the show, Matthew Calbraith Perry. Have you heard of this guy?
Name sounds familiar. What did he do?
Well, he was born on April 10th, 1794 in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, which is where I went to college. He was the younger brother of another noted American naval hero, Oliver Hazard Perry, and their father, Raymond, had fought in the American Revolution, enlisting in the local militia at age 14 before joining a privateer crew, which eventually folded into the actual Continental Navy.
Okay.
Raymond Perry was descended on one side from the original Pilgrim colonists in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and his wife, Sarah Wallace, shared ancestors with Sir William Wallace, as in Mel Gibson in Braveheart. So, we're talking about the closest thing the United States has to actual nobility.
It's the closest thing America has to a real superhero at the time.
Well, no, for that you gotta go to John Paul Jones. Though at this point, he was off being a pirate for the Russian Queen.
John Paul Jones was a hero.
John Paul Jones was a pirate.
He was a good pirate.
For comparison, Matthew Perry was a late bloomer, which means he didn't join the Navy until he was 17.
Real late.
I mean,
I was a late bloomer.
His dad joined at 14, his brother joined at 16.
I joined at 20.
Ah, well, clearly you must have joined as a high-ranking officer.
No.
Ah.
I was the bottom of the totem pole.
You mean like most people who join?
Like everybody, yeah.
Ah, well, he joined as a midshipman under his brother's command.
Huh.
Matthew went on to fight in the War of 1812 and the Second Barbary War, as well as the settlement of American colonists in Liberia. When we said, what if we sent black people back to Africa to set up their own United States and oppress the black people who already live there?
Huh.
He also spent some time hunting pirates with the West Indies Naval Squadron, while in command of a schooner, a sort of flat-bottomed sailing ship called the USS Shark. I want you to tell me at any point if I mention a type of ship that we still have, because I'm pretty sure none of them are still relevant.
We do not still have schooners.
I mean, it's a sailing ship, and the Constitution is a frigate.
Yes.
So
yeah. Constitution is the only sailing ship that is still commissioned.
Fun fact about the Constitution, because I don't remember which ship in the script this is, one of the ships we talk about today accidentally fired on the Constitution at some point.
Huh.
So by 1826, Matthew was promoted to fleet captain of the U.S. Mediterranean Squadron, patrolling all of Europe at that point and given command of a sloop called the USS Concord. Now, I haven't been able to figure this out, Ev, and it's an important detail to the show, so I'm hoping you can answer it for me. Do we still use squadrons as, like, a meaningful division of ships in the Navy?
Yeah. Like what I'm in right now, I'm in an amphibious squadron.
Okay.
It's made up of, like 4 or 5 ships. We make up the amphibious squadron 11, and we're all based out of Sasebo.
Okay, so that's roughly like a similar number of ships, maybe a little smaller than most of the international squadrons at this point in time.
Probably at that point in time, yeah.
But in the 19th century, the overseas squadrons functioned more like the various fleets within the modern Navy. So, you are in the Pacific Fleet. At this time, in the 1820s, there was a Pacific Squadron. To give a sense of scale, maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, back then, it would be one fleet made up of several squadrons.
Right.
Now we are one Navy made up of several fleets all around the world, which are all made up of smaller squadrons.
Yes. Though, weirdly, we actually are only less than 3 times the size of the total Navy during the period we're talking about. Though naval tactics have changed a bit, there was a period in the 1940s during World War II where we could just shit out boats all day long. We put out like an aircraft carrier every couple of months for a while in there. And now that takes like a decade.
Yeah.
So, Matthew Perry has the USS Concord in the Mediterranean Squadron, and at one point he put in at the Russian port of Kronstadt, where he was actually offered a commission in the Tsar's Navy, but he turned it down. Just in time to come back to the U.S. for shore duty in the Brooklyn Naval Yard in New York, and stake his first big claim to fame. While overseeing that shipyard, Matthew became the United States' biggest supporter of steam-powered ships. He oversaw the construction of the USS Fulton, the Navy's first steamer, and became its very first commanding officer. Now, at this time, fleet captain was actually the highest standard permanent rank you could have in the Navy. Lots of guys were promoted to rear admiral when they were retired, but during your service, normally you only ever got to captain. Which made it a big deal when Matthew Perry was promoted to Commodore, a rank that did not normally exist, to make it clear that he outranked everybody when he was moved up to the New York shipyard. He went on to serve in and eventually command the American Home Squadron during the Mexican-American War, and actually personally led the Marines when they assaulted the city of Tabasco, one of the last major blows before Mexican surrender, which helped the U.S. conquer everything from Texas to the Pacific. And well before taking over California, Lady Liberty started dipping her extra long toes into the Pacific from the Oregon Territory. The Latin American Wars for Independence in the 1810s and 1820s helped open trade routes around South America to North American merchants. And between that and British expansion to India, Western powers were more involved in East Asia than ever, especially China. The first major backlash against this came in 1839 with the First Opium War, when the United Kingdom literally went to war with the Qing dynasty, over the Brits' God-given right to pump that country full of drugs. It was an act of colonial violence greatly outdone by the modern system of shrugging, sending addicts to jail, and giving the Sackler family pharmaceutical grants.
Yeah.
So American merchants used British outposts to trade with China and the surrounding countries under a higher set of tariffs than everybody else, and forces from the U.S. Navy's East India Squadron actually fought in the Opium Wars, which is something I'm going to talk about in the next set of episodes. This was paired with Russian expansion across Siberia and the boom of the world's first oil industry, aka whale hunting. Basically, East Asia was suddenly part of European trade, and American merchants and whalers suddenly had lots of incentives to participate all through the region. The problem was, colonial Europe preferenced its own shipping and supplies, so sometimes Americans had trouble even finding enough coal to make the journey worthwhile or even possible. Through all of this, Japan continued to enforce sakoku and refused to allow white people past Nagasaki. Officially, that was limited to the Dutch and Portuguese, though Americans did fly the Dutch flag and trade on the Netherlands' behalf a couple of times during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe when the Dutch couldn't get out. In 1837, some Japanese fishermen shipwrecked in China, and an American businessman in Guangzhou tried to get them home as a way of maybe thawing relations with Japan. The Japanese opened fire with cannons as his ship approached, and as far as we know, those lost fishermen never got to go home.
Huh.
In 1846, the United States tried sending a 72-gun warship along with one of our merchants to threaten the Japanese by parking it in the middle of Edo Bay and demanding that they open trade with us. The Japanese ignored them until they went home.
Mm-hmm.
That brings us to 1852, when President Millard Fillmore tasked the U.S. East India Squadron with forcing Japan to open its trade routes. Evan, do you know anything about Millard Fillmore?
I do not know who that is.
That's fine, neither does anybody else.
Okay. Then he can't have been that important.
Did you know that's the name of an American president?
I do now.
That's also fine. He's up there with guys who died a few months into office in terms of historical impact.
Okay.
Except for the fact that it was his idea to do what we're talking about today, which may be one of the most influential decisions in all of world history. Weird balance on Millard Fillmore.
He wanted to nuke Japan?
Well, not directly. He wanted to trade with Japan, and that leads to a cascade of events that eventually leads to nuking Japan. Yeah, that. There's actually a very direct line from what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So initially, Matthew Perry was not in charge here. After the Mexican War, he was actually excited to start a new commission in command of the Mediterranean Squadron again, and become the chief American official in Europe. Unfortunately for him, the fleet captain for the East India Squadron was an asshole who caused an international incident while transporting a Brazilian diplomat, and he had to be replaced on short notice.
Okay.
Matthew Perry was the obvious choice as one of the most well-known commanders in the entire Navy, and the Commodore was dragged kicking and screaming into his new job in the Pacific, as well as being in charge of one of the most important missions in history. So on November 24th, 1852, the Perry expedition set out from Norfolk, Virginia, with 4 ships to include 3 steam-powered frigates and a cargo transport.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, even with steam power, they weren't going all that fast. It is still the 1850s. And it took 6 months to reach Japan. They also didn't have the advantage of a Panama Canal. Along the way, Matthew and his expedition made several stops for routine diplomatic and government business with other countries, colonies, and Americans living abroad. And it was some of those Americans who translated President Fillmore's letter into Dutch and Mandarin, since there were more likely to be Japanese people who could read those languages than English.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's not clear if anybody in Japan knew English at the time. On May 17th, 1853, the Perry expedition reached the Ryukyu Islands. Historically, they fluctuated between being unified among themselves, a bunch of small kingdoms, vassals of Japanese states, and vassals of China. By the 1850s, most of the chain was officially Japanese, but Okinawa and its nearest neighbors were officially the semi-autonomous Ryukyu Kingdom.
Okay.
However, they did pay tribute to the Satsuma daimyo up in Kyushu. But that autonomy gave Matthew Perry his opening. He sailed straight up to Okinawa, officially on the premise that the Ryukyu Kingdom was totally independent. But he also wasn't stupid. He flew the Dutch flag until he was sure there wasn't a Japanese armada waiting in the wings to ambush him before raising the Stars and Stripes. They sailed straight into the nearest port, demanded an audience with the Ryukyuan king, and Perry met King Shotai. There they worked out a deal where the Ryukyu Kingdom would openly trade with the United States and disregard the Tokugawa shogunate's isolationist policy. This also may have had something to do with the fact that Shotai knew his islands were outgunned and needed to get this crazy white guy out of his castle before anything bad happened.
Yeah.
After inducing Shotai and his kingdom into some light treason, Matthew thought it was a good idea to get the hell out of Dodge and went shopping.
Okay.
Specifically, he went back east, out into the Pacific, and headed for the Bonin Islands, officially Ogasawara today. Have you heard of these? You might have been there too, I don't actually know.
I don't believe so.
Bonin, or Ogasawara, is the overarching name for a group of island clusters between Guam and Japan. The most famous island on the chain is Iwo Jima.
I have never been to that chain, no.
Okay. They're also some of the only territory claimed by the Empire of Japan that the Allies let them keep after World War II. But in the 1850s, they were actually a grab bag of sparsely inhabited indigenous villages and very small European colonies that mostly acted as resupply depots for their navies. The first Americans actually arrived there with a British colonial project, and Matthew and his expedition stopped by at that colony to buy some land for $50 at the price of $1 an acre. This became the basis for a new American coal station officially called the Colony of Peel Island. So next time anybody tries to argue that the US didn't have colonies, using weasel words about how they're technically territories, you can point here to an official American colony.
Huh.
Also, even accounting for inflation, this colony only cost the American government about $2,000. Evan, do you know what you cannot get for $2,000 today?
A lot.
Yeah, there's not much of significance you can get with just $2,000.
$2,000 really isn't that much today.
But I am going to go out on a limb and guess that you can probably get at least one of the sponsors of this show.
For $2,000?
For $2,000 or less.
Well, I should hope so.
Hey, History of Persia fans. Before Persia, another civilization controlled the Middle East. The very first civilization, the inventors of writing itself. From the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia come the oldest stories. The history and myth of the first Mesopotamians is the subject of the Oldest Stories podcast online at oldeststories.net. If you like ancient history, come check out the Oldest Stories after you listen to this episode.
We are back, and I want to remind the Coca-Cola Corporation that my offer stands. Unlimited free publicity if you bring back Cinnamon Coke. This spiced stuff will not cut it. Until then, the Secret Wars People's Liberation Army is under strict orders to only buy RC Cola. What's that face for, Evan?
RC Cola? Really?
Until Coke gives in to my demands.
That's your counter is RC.
No, my counter is bring back Cinnamon Coke, and there's no problems here. Until then...
Yeah, but do you really think Coca-Cola is going to care about RC Cola?
They will if they're not buying Coke. That's kind of the point.
They don't care. RC Cola is so far under their radar. If you really want to get back at them, go get Pepsi.
Well, Pepsi has a Navy, and I'm not quite there yet.
Well... Pepsi could help you get the Cinnamon Coke back. They have a Navy.
We will form an alliance with Pepsi's vast naval armada against the Coca-Cola Corporation.
Yeah, exactly. The America's Secret Wars People Liberation Army, plus the Pepsi Navy. You'd be able to just tell Coca-Cola to give us back the Cinnamon Coke.
Pepsi, if you're listening, the email address for this podcast is secretwarspod@gmail.com. Well, speaking of buying things, after buying a discount colony, Matthew and company sailed east and headed for Japan proper. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the other Western delegates at Nagasaki, the Americans headed straight for Edo Bay and the capital city. Which I actually don't think I've mentioned. Edo was the name for Tokyo in this period. They were there to demand concessions from the shogun.
Mm-hmm.
And on July 8th, 4 warships, including 2 steamers and 2 sailing ships from the East India Squadron, turned toward the village of Uraga, which is part of modern Yokosuka, opened their gun ports, and fired 73 cannons.
Okay.
They did fire blanks, and when asked by Japanese authorities what the hell they were doing, the Americans said they were celebrating their own Independence Day. Never mind that they were 4 days late, and there's absolutely no reason to do that in a foreign port where you're not welcome. Everyone involved understood this demonstration crystal fucking clear. Come out and play, or the United States of America will open fire.
Yeah.
All of the expedition's ships were equipped with state-of-the-art Pesca guns, 220mm cannons that fired the first mass-produced explosive artillery shells, making this the first time in history that the United States threatened to use state-of-the-art explosives against Japan.
Huh.
Unbeknownst to the Americans, the shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was sick and bedridden at the time, meaning the guy in charge of making decisions about things like foreign invasions and trade deals was unavailable for comment when a few dozen cannons started going off just outside his palace. It took almost a full week for the shogun's ministers to figure out what to do, and the whole time Matthew Perry and his ships were just looming ominously off the coast. At one point, the Japanese sent out a ship with a big sign written in French ordering the Americans to leave. It is possible that they actually thought the Americans were French, because this would not be the first time that confusion came up on this show. The French changed their flag so often between different other versions of red, white, and blue that it was not an uncommon mistake in the early 1800s. Today, France only has to deal with that with Russia.
Yeah.
Instead of leaving, Matthew Perry sent out scouting boats and had his Chinese interpreters draft a letter to the Japanese guard boats surrounding the American fleet, warning that they would be annihilated if they did not withdraw. Eventually, the Japanese decided they just needed to do something to get rid of the Americans and get them to come back when the shogun wasn't actively dying. So, they decided that exchanging letters wouldn't violate the Sakoku policy, and had Commodore Perry come ashore to briefly explain that the shogun was sick, internal politics were up in the air, and he could come back in a year for an official response. The Commodore agreed, the Americans went back to Hong Kong to wait it out, and things immediately went to shit.
Well, they probably didn't like that.
Well, they didn't like it, but, they were outgunned. They didn't have much they could do about it.
So I guess we used state-of-the-art explosives on them for the first time in history?
No, the Russians showed up.
So the Russians used state-of-the-art explosives.
No, they went to Nagasaki and tried to do it the official way. They got turned down too. But then the shogun died immediately after the Russians left.
Yeah.
He was replaced by the much less experienced and physically ill son named Tokugawa Ieyasu, and that did not make Japan feel more stable. But the fact that other countries were trying to open Japan up by force meant that Matthew Perry didn't want anybody beating him to the punch. So he left Hong Kong in February, about 6 months before he said he would actually return. They still had to make stops for fuel and maintenance, though, and on their way they made a brief stop in Keelung, Taiwan. They were there to investigate the possibility of setting up an American coal mining colony on the island, which is an issue that will definitely come up again and soon on this series. Nothing came out of it during Perry's visit, but his writings about Taiwan made sure that it stayed a subject of American foreign policy for the next 15 years. Bit of a different version of world history if we annexed Taiwan in the 1860s, right?
Yeah. We would have, so much more issues with China.
Yeah, if we just owned Taiwan directly instead of
just diplomatically.
Just kind of vaguely militarily.
Yeah.
So during their break in China and Taiwan, Matthew Perry also hand-selected a series of the most experienced officers and strongest ships in the squadron to back up his original expedition fleet when they returned to Japan. So on March 14th, 9 American warships, including 3 state-of-the-art steam frigates, were anchored in Edo Bay. They also included a cargo ship called the USS Supply. We just don't name things like that anymore. It's like naming a boat Bodie McBoatface.
Yeah. I mean, there is the USS Mercy, which kind of delivers just mercy.
Is that mercy in the form of death?
No, that's mercy in the form of it's a hospital ship. And,
The only way that could be more on the nose if it were the USS Mercy General or something like that.
Yeah.
So, internally, the shogun had already decided to accept all of the Americans' demands, but they were still kind of hoping they could procrastinate and just have Matthew Perry give up again. So for several weeks, boats with translators and diplomats and negotiators went to and from the Japanese capital to the American ships, until, tired of all this, the Commodore snapped and threatened to return the next year with 100 ships and assault Japan in open war if they did not give in to the United States' demands. It should be noted that the United States did not have this kind of power, and there were only about 120 ships in the entire Navy, including several dozen that were not fit for duty. But Japan didn't know that at the time. It's the unfortunate backside to isolationism. You don't know what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a situation where someone sails in and is like, we're gonna come back with 300 ships.
Yeah. I mean,
like next month.
They could have just said next month, and Japan would have no way to know that they were bluffing.
That's what they did.
Yeah.
That would be like if we took the entire U.S. Navy and sent it to one place.
There wouldn't be that one place anymore. If we sent today's Navy to one place.
I think just, like, the sea level change would probably have an impact.
Yeah.
So if that doesn't give you a sense of the Commodore's ego at this point, this will. On March 8th, when he was finally allowed to come ashore at Kanagawa, a village near Yokohama, he came with 27 landing boats, 500 Marines and sailors, including 3 military bands playing the Star-Spangled Banner, which was not the national anthem at the time.
No.
He just picked his favorite America song. He was acting like he had just conquered Japan and not convinced them to trade coal and fancy plates for outdated military surplus. The two sides spent the next 3 weeks negotiating over gifts from the U.S., and there were cultural displays on both sides. The gifts included a lot of incentives to convince Japan that modernization was a good idea, like a fully functional miniature locomotive, a basic telegraph system, tons of military surplus from the war against Mexico, and books about America translated into languages that the Japanese were more familiar with.
Okay.
But possibly the most exciting gift was 100 gallons of America's finest cultural export, whiskey. We know how to make friends, if nothing else. We know how to make enemies faster, but we do know how to make friends. To entertain their guests, the Japanese put on a sumo exhibition tournament with the highest-ranked fighters in the country. And in exchange, the sailors of the USS Powhatan, a ship named after a Native American tribe almost entirely wiped out in the conquest of Virginia, smeared their skin with blackface and put on a goddamn minstrel show as the best show of American culture they could come up with.
That's kind of nuts that they went with that to...
I mean, it was 1855.
Still, I mean, that's what they chose to, like, show off, say, hey, this is what America's about. This is our culture. They went with...
You gotta understand, everybody. Minstrel shows were so popular up until, like, the 1920s. They were one of the most popular mainstream forms of entertainment, was a bunch of dudes in blackface doing stereotypes of American black people as a piece of performance art. This was actually kind of America's equivalent to sumo wrestling in Japan.
That's pretty nuts. That's kind of crazy, actually. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was massively popular. Also massively popular in the Netherlands. And still an issue of controversy over there at Christmas time. But finally, on March 31st, the negotiators, including Matthew Perry, signed the KanagawaDepartment, which stipulated mutual peace between the United States and the Empire of Japan, something that would never ever be violated, opening of the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American trade, assistance and proper treatment to be provided to American shipwrecked victims, freedom of movement for temporary foreign residents within the treaty ports, currency exchange to facilitate actual trade between the two countries, giving the Japanese government an official monopoly on provisioning American ships in Eastern Asia, but also requiring Japan to give the United States favorable positioning in any trade agreement they made with another country, basically creating the same deal between the US and Japan that the British enforced on China around the same time. They opened an American consulate at Shimoda, which later moved several times, and the treaty had to be ratified within 18 months, and this became the straw that broke the camel's back. Once American trade flooded into Japanese markets, the shogun was forced to accept other Europeans into his country. The United States became Japan's foremost ally in world politics for decades to come, and Matthew Perry was rewarded the title of Rear Admiral and $20,000 in 1856 for his service to the country, when he returned home to have Congress ratify the treaty. In Japan, the flood of treaties granting trade concessions became known as the Unequal Treaties, and they threatened increasing Christianization and trade deficits all over the country. They were afraid of becoming a puppet state like China, and the one bulwark they had against this was the shogun allowing the daimyos to rearm themselves and take on more local independence. And that is where we will pick up in part 2. Evan, your thoughts on the story so far?
The story so far is a good chunk of naval history that they don't really teach us in the Navy. But it's good to hear, especially with the environment that I've lived in for the past 3 years.
Yeah, you're in, like, the Nagasaki prefecture, right?
I am. I'm like 2 hours away from Nagasaki.
Yeah, so, like, you are an American military base in the thick of what this story is about.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is the story of how Japan started trading with Western powers on unequal but voluntary terms. And it will spiral further out of control in the next episode. Evan, do you have anything you want to plug? Normally my guests are people with their own podcasts and stuff. Have a TV recommendation for anybody? Anything like that?
I don't really got much to plug. If you haven't watched Invincible on Amazon Prime, I highly suggest it.
Solid show.
Yeah. Cyberpunk 2077. It's a good game now. Only took them a year to fix it, but it's a solid game now.
All right. And if you want more information about this podcast, the website is secretwarspod.com. You'll find things like an about page. It's an ever-growing project. Eventually there will be more direct ways to support the show, though for now, you can donate through the link in the description or by going to patreon.com/thehistoryofpersia. And until next time, see ya!
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, a history of Valois Burgundy.
You are listening to the History of Persia podcast. And as we've been hearing from Trevor, the history of the Persian Empire is a story of Persian domination of much of the Middle East and Central Asia. But this was not the first time these lands were conquered, and it would certainly not be the last. I don't want to give too much away, but in the year 329 BCE, the important Persian city of Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan was conquered by some guy by the name of Alexander. But what's interesting about this city is that about 1700 years later, this same city, Samarkand, would be the glowing capital of an empire forged by a man known as Timur, or Tamerlane, or simply Timur. And Timur has gone down in history as a fantastic tactician, a man who supposedly never lost a battle, a great patron of the arts, and one of the most brutal conquerors of all time. From about 1365 until 1405 CE, Timur was almost constantly at war, building for himself an empire that stretched from modern-day Turkey to India, from Syria to the Russian steppe, and I want to know how and why this happened. If that sounds interesting to you and you want the story of Timur told by a guy who talks too fast and has loud neighbors, then check out my show, The Timur Podcast. Find out more about it at timurpodcast.com or listen to it in most places where you find podcasts. And with that said, take it away, Trevor.